So since this whole coronavirus thing started to happen and churches couldn't gather the way that they're used to gathering, it's had me thinking about this question: is the church health bubble popping, or is it going to pop the longer this goes on? Right now we're only about 2 weeks into quarantine in New Jersey, but I can't help but think that if this continues for much longer, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, who knows, that there's going to be some serious popping of churches. And so the question is, why? Because that's never really happened throughout history. Whenever the real church was applied pressure, it actually expanded rather than popping. And it makes me think that perhaps what we're used to seeing as health in churches isn't actually health at all. You see, we have this kind of modern phenomena over the last however many years where we have one person who has all the answers, and then we have people who just come en masse to hear them speak, to hear them share. Now, with this kind of environment, what's happened is we've seen church growth, so to say. We still have, the fastest growing churches in the United States and these sorts of things. But the truth is that a large number of these churches have just been sucked into those larger churches with a vacuum. Now, of course, they look healthy because they have lots of money. They have really good teaching. In other words, they have engaging sermons. They have probably high-quality music. They also have impact in society. And so maybe they're helping the least of these. And they're helping people with social justice issues. And I'm not saying that they don't speak the gospel or preach the gospel. Many of them are actually gospel-centered. That being said, the role of the church, how the New Testament describes a healthy church, is very different than these sorts of things. You see, in the New Testament, we see that the church leadership in Ephesians 4 is tasked with the idea of equipping the saints, or equipping the people of God for ministry, equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. The problem is that in this model over here, it's about doing the ministry instead of equipping for the ministry. You see, in our current church models, what's happened is that we have been having professionals do the work of the ministry rather than equipping other people to do the work of the ministry. But this isn't what we see commanded. For example, in 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul says to Timothy, "What you've heard from me in the presence of others, entrust to faithful men who will in turn pass on to others as well, teach others as well." And so what we see here is you have Paul, and he is talking to Timothy, but Timothy isn't alone. He's talking to some other people as well. We don't know how many. And then he's saying, "Hey, Timothy," this is Timmy. He's saying, "What you have heard from me in the presence of other people, I want you to in turn teach others." He's standing on his head. "Who will in turn teach others also." See, this kind of model, which is the model that we see commanded in the New Testament, requires a completely different set of skills from this model. See, this model, to be successful, it requires lots of money. It requires institutions that are going to hand out diplomas, right? It requires people who are hyper-trained because no one's going to come listen to you if you can't actually draw a crowd. It requires people who have an incredible skill set of music because no one's going to want to come to this church if the people who are singing can't even stay in key. And this is also where so many people wind up compromising on the gospel, because you have to say, well, how do we keep them? And so we've seen in recent years churches compromise, not wanting to talk about truth, not wanting to stick to the authority of the scriptures, because they have to figure out, how do you keep people in these seats? And so we've had a perspective in our society where we think that we have health. But what I would like to suggest to you is that we haven't really had health. And that's the question that I think the church needs to be wrestling with today is, have we been healthy as churches? As we wrestle with that, I think the only thing that's a very clear answer is that for the vast majority is no. Now, have we been healthy as in, do we preach the Bible? Yeah, I think people preach the Bible. Are we healthy as in we're doing good things? Well, yes. But have we equipped? Have we equipped? Which is the command for apostles and prophets and evangelists and shepherds and teachers. Have we equipped our people? Do your people know how to make a disciple? And more than that, do they know how to make a disciple who will be able to make more disciples? You see, what we see in history is this kind of progression of the church. In the early stages, the church grows virally, and it really explodes. And so we see this in the book of Acts, we see this continuing, and people growing in mass, right? Now, as things begin to formalize, we see house churches develop. And we see that there are some people who are a little bit more talented than others, and so maybe their house church is a little bigger. Maybe it actually goes and gets a building instead of this guy who is he's just a run-of-the-mill guy. And this house church, they meet under a tree. But we see people coming to faith. But as these churches get bigger, and as the superstars become a little bit more prevalent, what happens is expectations begin to change. And now these organizations require more money, and they need more training, and they need more education, and they need better this, better that. And so as these organizations have that training, have those resources, the churches get bigger and bigger until we get this, what we started with up here. Now, the issue is that in the process of doing this, all of these smaller churches, they all kind of get sucked into this church as we have in our original drawing. But see, there's an important thing that happens here, and this is my concern. You see, in this blue line, which I'm drawing, is what we would call the priesthood of believers. And what that means is that everybody is called to do the work of the ministry. Every disciple is a disciple maker. That's one of the core things that we see in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there was a Levitical tribe, a priestly tribe. But in the New Testament, we are called that we are priests, a priesthood of all people. You see, leading up to the Reformation of the Catholic Church, you had the early on, you had this priesthood of all believers, and then it began to taper off. And then it got to the point very early on, even within the first couple centuries, you weren't allowed to speak in church if you weren't an official clergy. And so the priesthood of the believer line drops, and you have more and more professionals doing the work up here instead of every believer. You see, right now, I think that we are at a very crucial place because this is where we are. We're kind of in need of another reformation. And what's happened is that this coronavirus has put us in a situation where this whole environment is in threat. And we're realizing that we actually don't know how to bring the priesthood of the believer back up. Because instead of actually equipping our people so that this has continued like this, we've let the professionals do it, and then this line has started to plummet. And so now we're at a really important stage. The question is, what will we do about it? Because the church bubble is popping. Have we equipped our people? What do we need to do to equip our people differently? We need to return to the Word. We need to return to this Spirit, trusting that the Spirit is our teacher, that the Spirit is going to lead us, and we need to make sure that every disciple is a disciple maker. See, I'll leave you with this thought. In Matthew 28:18-20, Jesus says, "All authority on heaven and earth has been given unto me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." He tells them to go and make disciples of all nations. He tells them to go baptize people. He tells them to go teach people to obey everything he's commanded, and he says he will be with them. You see, and we love the idea that Jesus is with all of us. And we agree with the idea that people should be baptized. But do we agree with the idea that everybody should be equipping other people to obey Jesus? See, those are commands not just for professionals, pastors, missionaries, professors, but they're for everyone.